Hello, and welcome to another edition of Heavy Hands. I am your host, Connor Rebush, joined, as always, by the great, the mighty, the powerful, the English, Phil McKenzie. What's up, Phil?
Well, you're pushing the boat out this time. Not only did people get treated to 3 hellos, but I feel like I've got a nice, a nice bring in there in the intro. Thank you very much, Connor.
You're so
I'm not doing
welcome.
too bad.
You're so welcome. Hopefully you're doing even better now that I've hyped you up, because I am looking to depress you with the thought that Max Holloway and Kamaru Usman might possibly lose this weekend. That's right, folks. We've got UFC 245 ahead of us, and for this week's episode, we're pretty much just going to cover these 3 title fights. They are, in order, Kamaru Usman versus Colby Covington, Max Holloway versus Alexander Volkanovski, and Amanda Nunes versus Germaine de Randamie. All of those, to me, are very interesting matchups, really compelling fights. Of course, the main event of UFC 245 is Usman versus Covington, but something you may notice about that fight is that it's extremely wrestly. So what I've done is brought in the Fight Site's Ed Gallo, who I think most of you enjoyed his appearance on our off-week episode 2 weeks ago, where he talked about wrestling and MMA, and I brought him in to break that one down with me. Phil was not at that record, so segment 2 of today's episode is just going to be me and Ed breaking down the main event, and Phil and I are going to start where I suspect we both would have rather the card ended anyway, with Max Holloway versus Alexander Volkanovski. And then after segment 2, we'll be back to discuss Amanda Nunes versus Germaine de Randamie. So it is going to be a dense and fully loaded episode of Heavy Hands. Only 3 fights, all 3 of them extremely interesting. Phil, thoughts on the card as a whole?
I mean, it's amazing. It's one of the ones they do every now and again, which reminds you of how good the UFC can be. Mm-hmm. It's not perhaps the top to bottom incredibleness that they've put out before, but you can't really front on 3 title fights, all of which are genuinely intriguing. Yeah.
It's a little more top-heavy than some of the classic stacked cards, but it's really easy to forgive that given the fact that we have 3 incredible fights at the top. All right, so let's start talking about this co-main event. This is the main event of my heart, of course. Listeners of the show will know I love Max Holloway dearly and am constantly just like fretting and wringing my hands. Note to up-and-coming fighters, like if you want, and I know this is the greatest prize available to professional prize fighters, is if you want my endless adoration and love, all you have to do is utterly destroy my favorite fighter respectfully and then be nice about it afterwards. And I will love you. That's Max Holloway. And I don't know. There is some reason to be concerned for him here. I think, hell, we've talked about Max Holloway a lot. Why don't we start this off trying to lay out the case for Alexander Volkanovski? What kind of fighter is he? What have we seen from his recent performances? Phil, I know that you, for example, recently went on thetwitter.com and you were saying, as you've said to me before, that Alexander Volkanovski is one of the smartest fighters in the sport today. Why do you say that?
Because we haven't seen him a huge amount at the highest level of the sport. He's not someone who's had to fight a lot of elite fighters, but when he's come out against them, he has shown a masterful ability to tune his approach.
Yeah.
And he's one of those rare fighters where you could look at how you might approach a given fighter and then say, if I could rearrange this hypothetical, Alexander Volkanovski skill set to be the right approach for this guy, I would tell him to do X, Y, and Z. And it's the rare example of where you can see him doing almost exactly that. He puts together these kind of protean game plans for people like Chad Mendes and Jose Aldo, who, whilst they might potentially be not in the prime of their careers, were still incredibly dangerous in very different ways. And he fought almost polar opposite game plans against them.
Yeah, I think the sort of shocking thing about Volkanovski is that his game works more like the way that people tend to think MMA games work. You know, where like it really does function as just a skill set with a lot of flexibility from one fight to the next. And I think people, you know, will often look at a matchup and try to break it down and say, well, but this person can do this. And I'm not saying I'm immune to this either. Like I get wishful thinking all the time when it comes to making predictions. So they'll be like, well, this person can do this. Look at this example and this example. And it's always useful to step back and look at it from a more of a style or strategic perspective, a sort of a wider scope where you're like, all right, are they going to be able to do that though in these circumstances, and how consistently? But for Volkanovski, what we've seen, especially in these last two fights from against Chad Mendes and Jose Aldo, is that he really can just sort of use his skill set in, I don't know, I guess, God, I hate to be as pretentious as you, Phil, but protean is probably the right word for it. This really,
yes.
this really,
join me, Connor.
Yeah. You know, TJ Dillashaw had a protean game plan. I don't know. That was a really, really half-formed protein pun. Please, I've already decided to edit it out. Let's move on.
So, I mean, one of the things which made those two game plans so impressive is that, or so unexpected, it's not just that they were different, is that they were different approaches, is that they had different philosophical, like, they typically have kind of different philosophical drives behind them. Mm-hmm. It's one thing for someone to go, the person I am, and this is who Alexander Volkanovski looked like, is someone who puts relentless pressure on people and breaks them. Mm-hmm. Because he did that to most of the people that he fought, and he did it to Chad Mendes, and you can say, okay, that is who you are as a person. To then ask that person to win a dull points victory is... You know, that requires a tremendous amount of smarts and discipline, and that's what he did against Jose Aldo.
Yeah, it was like when Gene Fulmer, Kyle McLaughlin is loving this right now. Gene Fulmer has like one fight in his career. People who don't know Gene Fulmer, he fought Ray Robinson a bunch of times. He ate the most perfect left hook ever thrown and got knocked out, but he also beat Robinson in the majority of their fights. He was a great crude mess of a fighter. And he had a fight with this guy named Spider Webb. And
nice.
Yeah, love old school boxing names. And he just came out, and this like crude slugger outboxed Spider Webb. He fought off the back foot. He was super patient. It wasn't a brawl at all. And like, I just don't think people understand how difficult that is to do. Like, fighting is incredibly stressful. Like, who you are is gonna come out most of the time. You're under duress. You don't really have time to put on an affect. And people who can do that is remarkable. I tend to think for Volkanovski that it's maybe he has sort of untapped the Alistair Overeem secret, by which I do not mean all of the stuff that used to be secret inside of Alistair Overeem's head, which is now unfortunately public knowledge. I mean, like, we have always said that, when Overeem adopted his more out-fighting style, or at least I always looked at that as sort of him channeling his bully mentality in a different way. Not having to give up, like, how his personality affected his fighting, but just finding a different way to feel like a bully. And so he went from being the bully who would push you up against the locker to being the bully who would throw an egg at you and ride off on his bike. But in both senses, he gets to feel bigger and stronger and more powerful. That's how I always viewed that. And I think for Volkanovski, that's kind of what we saw in the Aldo fight. This is still, from a certain perspective, a relentlessly aggressive performance. It's just that like 80% of that aggressive output is just feinting and not actually hitting the other guy. But it still looks to me like a fight where Volkanovski got to feel like he was powerful and in charge because he was like, he could tell he was playing games inside Jose Aldo's head. And making him second guess. He was still putting pressure on someone, but it's remarkable to me still that you can have the flexibility as a fighter to be able to channel that like deeper need that Volkanovski must feel to smash people and put pressure on them and be aggressive into a totally, almost completely non-violent style of fighting, at least compared to what we usually see out of him. So I just want to underline how I think that functions, but also why it's still remarkable to me, because it's really rare that fighters can do that.
Yeah, and I think that is also, that's the technical element which has allowed him to have that kind of success against fighters like Mendes and Aldo, is that his ability to dictate the pace without committing to things was something which allowed him to consistently push Mendes up against the fence. And it meant that Aldo was rarely biting because he couldn't tell the difference between a light Volkanovski strike or one of his feints. Volkanovski started off with an insane diet of kind of jazz hands jiggling, and then just used it, kind of slowly pared it down to work his way into range. And that's where one of the interesting dynamics in this fight itself comes in, because this is a fight between two great feinters in MMA. One of whom has been like that for a while, and one of whom has really kind of settled into it as of late.
Yeah. Well, I guess we should start breaking down the matchup. Difficult. This is so once again, and I think you mentioned this on Twitter recently, this is another fight where we have to look at it and say whoever's getting pushed back is probably losing this fight. Yeah, that's just whoever takes over heavy hands after me. It will be a legacy show, and I'm just going to hire the person who just always picks the guy who goes forward, because I do think that's a pretty reliable way of predicting this sport.
Yeah, we've talked a bit about how Holloway is at his most vulnerable when he can be forced a couple of steps into an exchange, and he can be compelled to just bail and move backwards. Because at this point, he will just start to kind of scuttle backwards with his head up in the air. And this seems like it really should ideally be Volkanovski's primary way of... this should be his primary goal. He needs to force Holloway into those kind of situations where he can potentially, not only land combinations to the head, but, go to the body as well. He's a good body puncher. He's a short guy. He keeps a good pace. This is where he can make a slightly different... he can take a slightly different approach than, for example, Poirier did when Poirier was rushing.
Perhaps critical is that Volkanovski is also a really capable kicker. Which tends to be open when you get the opponent bounding backwards. That's the funny thing about Max Holloway, is that his footwork is almost entirely nice, small, subtle steps, except for when he's actually forced to retreat. And that's why I think he always looks at his most vulnerable when he's just sort of bounding backwards. It's like he goes from being like Peter Yan to Luke Rockhold. Obviously not quite that extreme, but unfortunately he has a chin, unlike Rockhold. But he suffers the same problems off the back foot as Rockhold. So yeah, how do you think Volkanovski forces him into those retreats? What are the triggers?
I'm not really sure. I mean, he's going to have to establish a series. He's going to have to establish his own jab, and I'm not sure how well he can do that against Max Holloway. And he needs to establish that behind feints, because both Aldo and Mendes are fundamentally, less. They're much less take one to give one fighters than Holloway is.
Yeah.
It's one of the things that makes Holloway, a next generation fighter compared to them, is that he is willing to both keep a pace and to roll and deflect shots rather than give up his zone of offense or his or the pace that he's keeping. So I think, Volkanovski has to feint his way inside without getting jabbed up by Holloway, and then just combination punch, basically the Poirier game plan.
Mm-hmm.
The main thing is that if he forces Holloway back, Holloway's going to hit the cage. What does Volkanovski do there? Because one of the things that has been, I guess, if not necessarily troubling, but as Volkanovski's striking has improved, the thing which was winning him his fights earlier on in his career has done so less, which is primarily his clinch work and his offensive wrestling. Like, it is clearly good, and he is still tireless and powerful, but he didn't get a lot done against Jose Aldo until Aldo was tired out.
I tend to think that was actually a stroke of genius for Aldo. I think, like, you don't want to shoot on Aldo, because, like, I watched the Volkanovski fight of Aldo's. I was thinking about this a lot because, I was discussing and debating this with some of those scooter boys, how impressive that performance of Volkanovski's really was. And they tend to think that Aldo just looked shot in that fight. And I think he's definitely lost some steps, but also I think I see my youthful self in them. They love Aldo too much to acknowledge that he could perhaps be neutralized by someone who isn't taking him down. But that's the thing. Like, I watched the Kenny Florian fight of Aldo's after that Volkanovski fight, and a lot of the same problems are there. I just wanted to think of someone who had a sort of similar approach. But Kenny kept shooting. And, like, 30% of the time he shot, Aldo would fucking smash him to the ground and climb on top of him and hit him. Volkanovski didn't give Aldo any of those chances. He didn't put himself in any scrambles that would cost a lot of energy or allow Aldo to sort of sun him. He just, like, went to the clinch, which, like, all of Aldo's incredible defensive wrestling doesn't really have anything to do with the clinch. And I think he just wanted to hold him against the fence because he's like, I've won 3 minutes of this round. I'm just going to neutralize him. And not
it's
go.
A possibility.
I think there's probably an element of him focusing more on his striking. Like, it feels inevitable because we have seen his depth of striking blossom so much in his last few fights. But it's important to note that, he out-grappled Jeremy Kennedy, who is a grappler. He went out there and did the same thing. Darren Elkins, it made perfect sense to keep it on the feet and strike with him. I don't hold it against him that he couldn't out-wrestle Chad Mendes. He certainly didn't get out-wrestled. And then against Jose Aldo, I don't know. I can't fault him for not shooting. So it's still a question worth asking, but I'm not ready to say yet that, like, Volkanovski's wrestling is not there. The problem, your question still stands, though. Like, Max Holloway has shown really, really solid takedown defense. He does not rest when he gets into any sort of wrestling engagement. He is always working to improve his position, to create space between himself and his opponent. He is, I think, the best clinch fighter Volkanovski will have ever fought.
So that's my main question. It's not so much wrestling. It's not so much wrestling defense. It's clinch offense.
Yeah.
It's how much, like, pure violence can Volkanovski unload in there? Because, like I said, that was sort of his calling card when he first came to the UFC.
He hit Mizuta Hirota with a full 3 or 4 spinning elbows from that position, so yeah.
But that's something I don't think we've seen as much of lately. And like you said, like, Max is both a very good clinch fighter and a very good interstitial fighter between the pocket and the clinch. He's very good at fighting grips, at disengaging, pushing off, and then coming back. He's very good with elbows. And he keeps an incredible pace. So I think one of the things that's going to define this fight is that it is going to be another. I think it's going to be similar to the Ortega fight in that it is just going to be very, very violent.
Yeah.
I don't think both of these guys, weirdly enough, despite being otherwise incredibly brutal, had sort of point-winning performances last time out. Holloway against Edgar and Volkanovski against Aldo. And I don't think we're seeing that this time. Because I think it's going to be difficult to get and keep a lead against either one of these guys. and B, because both of them were sort of facing last generation fighters.
Yeah.
In terms of the pace and the approach that they take. And they were just like, I just need to get ahead of this guy in terms of strikes landed. And he is not, he simply doesn't throw enough throwaway shots for him to be able to catch up with me. Mm-hmm. And I think in both of these cases, that is just not going to happen.
I tend to agree. I'm going to co-sign the prediction of extreme violence. Maybe that's not such a bold prediction because, except for those last two fights, both of these guys are, like you said, typically very violent fighters. But I think at the end of the day, like we're getting at the point where we should be rendering our predictions. That means I still have to favor Max Holloway. I think it really comes down to, for me, like the thing that has me most worried for Max, and also is also the thing that I think favors him as the fight goes on, which is that I think Volkanovski is a really underrated athlete. The man is very quick. Like he's tremendously explosive, and I think we've only seen more of that since he has relaxed in his striking and stopped putting full power into everything he throws. We used to see him do that like all the time, like his fight with Mizuta Hirota, which I don't think is it's maybe the best parallel for a Max Holloway on his record. And in that fight, like he was throwing all power and was really wearing down as the fight went on. I think he's fixed that a bit, but we know what it's like to fight Max Holloway. Like he demands the pace, like because if you don't respond with your output, he drowns you. You have to fight him. It has to be violent, basically, if you're going to beat Max Holloway. And I just don't see Volkanovski being able to maintain that snap and that speed throughout for the full length of a 5-round fight. And if he doesn't, I think while Max Holloway might be at his weakest off the back foot, I think Volkanovski is far more easily neutered. Like he doesn't have as much defensive nuance. He's maybe actually arguably a better counterpuncher than Max Holloway. But he is also going to be dealing with lots and lots of Max Holloway jabs. I don't think he can deal with the sort of creativity of volume that Holloway can put out once he's got someone backing up. I don't know. I just think like every Max Holloway fight sort of reaches a point where once you concede to backing up and trying to find a little time to rest, he just carves out bigger and bigger pieces of you until there's nothing left. So,
yeah, I mean, I don't think he's the definition of how good a counterpuncher Max Holloway is a tricky one, because so much of his best counterpunches are typically drawn out from him initiating exchanges.
Yeah,
maybe in neutral space, I think Volkanovski in general, he's just defined by a really smart deployment of like basic fundamentals. So he doesn't have a very deep game, but it's just incredibly functional. He's
flexible.
He's got a slip and right hand, and he's got a couple of catch and pitch counters, and those have served him very, very well. In general, I think that level of simplicity on defense will probably not serve him tremendously well, because I think he's going to have to go back into neutral exchanges with Holloway over and over again. And I think Holloway will basically just pry those learned defensive options apart. In terms of the athleticism, I totally agree with that. I mean, like, not only has he been very fast, he's been very strong. He's been also had great cardio. I mean, that Hirota fight, as he mentioned, he slowed down a bit, but like that was after a hellacious pace he put out.
He thought he was about to finish Hirota at about 3 different points, so he poured out a lot of energy, more than he normally would, I think.
But the other thing that he is he is small.
Yeah.
He's only looked very slightly bigger than Chad Mendes. Which means that he is going to be at a reach disparity when it comes comes to like establishing that jab approach. So yeah, in general, I do favor Max Holloway. I think that neutral exchange that Volkanovski is going to have to initiate, I don't think he has quite the defensive subtlety. I don't think he has the reach, and I'm not sure how much that lasts to Holloway's pace. But I think this might be a decision, and it might actually be a reasonably competitive one. But I'm fascinated to see how Volkanovski approaches this, because, as I said, I've become incredibly impressed by how he approaches his fights.
Yeah, same. The funny thing is, just one more point, is that he actually has a slight reach advantage over Holloway. One of the enduringly weird facts about Holloway's frame is that his arms are actually very short for his height, but he's a full 5 inches shorter. So if we consider the angles between, the shoulder firing the jab and the head it's targeting, I think Max Holloway is still going to have a much easier time landing jabs to the face. And Holloway may not be as quick as Volkanovski, but boy, is he annoying with how he uses his reach. He's got that really long guard. His jab always starts like already only 8 inches away from your chin, so he just has to do barely anything to hit you with it. And we've seen that weapon getting better for him too. I think that Edgar fight was one of the best jabbing performances of Max Holloway's career. So yeah, I think it'll still feel like he has a reach advantage over Volkanovski, and that means to me that Volkanovski's going to have to use a lot of his speed and his explosion to make up for it. And there's a limit to that kind of thing. So yeah, both of us picking Max Holloway, both of us expecting an insanely violent and competitive fight. It is going to be a banger. And even if it turns in, this is one of those where even if it comes in, it turns out more slowly than I expect. I can't imagine it not being fascinating. These are two fighters that I have great respect for and really interested in the different ways that they approach different opponents. Okay, let's take a break. When Heavy Hands comes back, you will be listening to me talking to Ed Gallo about Kamaru Usman versus Colby Covington. After that, Amanda Nunes versus Germaine de Randamie after this.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it.
All right, I am here joined once again by popular demand by Ed Gallo. We are going to talk about the wrestliest of these three title fights slated for UFC 245. Ed, welcome back to the show. Thanks for joining me again.
Thanks, man. I got yelled at by Keith Galvin for not shouting him out last time, so shout out to Keith Galvin. Also, since it was a Overeem fight week last week, I just want to set the record straight that Keith invented Stipe tapped and Alistair felt it. That is his meme, and he never gets credited for it. So please give credit to Keith Galvin whenever you talk about Stipe definitely tapping.
We'll go ahead.
Which he did.
We'll go ahead and cut all that. But thanks again for joining me. As I said, Colby Covington versus Kamaru Usman, indisputably the most wrestly of these three title fights lined up for us. And I don't know, there are a couple ways which we could, I think, springboard into the discussion of the matchup. On the one hand, I kind of just want you to tell me your take for each of these guys' wrestling games. But as we get into that, I'm also interested in understanding, what kind of fight this is liable to be. A lot of the time, like MMA fans are well used to the idea that when two grapplers or two wrestlers fight, their A games frequently cancel one another out, as both guys just sort of agree or go into the fight in the hopes that their B game is going to be better than the other guys. This does not strike me as that kind of matchup. I have a hard time envisioning these guys not clashing and tying up and getting into some crazy wrestling scrambles. So what do you make of it as a matchup? And what would you say, like, if you can sum it up, these guys' strengths or attitudes or styles as wrestlers?
Sure. So as wrestlers, I mean, Colby is pretty stereotypical for American wrestlers, especially at the D1 level. He's like a volume shooter, takes a lot of leg attacks, pretty tenacious on that front, not afraid to put himself in bad positions and try to fight through them. Basically like an American Khabib in a sense, as far as his work from neutral.
He's the kind of guy who belongs in a T-shirt that says something like "Live for the grind" or something like that.
Yeah, he's that dude. So he's all about pace and just keep working, get involved in shootouts. I didn't watch a lot of his college matches, but I assume if he was the same guy, he was probably in a lot of high scoring matches, getting taken down, giving up reversals, getting a lot of takedowns, trying to push to the end. He's that kind of guy. And he does most of his work on the cage. And I think that's just a product of his come forward striking style, volume puncher, volume kicker. He hits the cage on a double, on a single. Sometimes he'll come up to the underhook, which we'll talk about later. He can body lock off of that if he has a good position, but he's mostly Mr. Double and single on the cage kind of guy. And usually it's the locking hands finish for him. And then Usman's pretty interesting, actually. He is way more patient. As a wrestler, he mostly liked to counter from what I saw. I really only watched his freestyle matches. For anyone that didn't know, real quick breakdown of the credentials. So Covington wrestled in junior college for his first year. He went to Iowa Central, which is where John Jones went as well. Won a national title in junior college, which is, impressive. It's never really hard. It's hard to quantify what that actually means because you have to look at who is at the weight.
Sure.
So maybe it meant something, maybe it didn't. They transferred to Oregon State, and he made the NCAA tournament twice. And the first time he was round of 12, I believe. So he was one match away from becoming an All-American. And then his senior year, he did become an All-American. He actually, in the
That's
medal
top 8,
round,
right?
Yeah, top 8. In the medal round, he beat the same guy that beat him in that tournament. So the same guy that knocked him out of the championship bracket, he beat him. I looked at his bracket that year. It wasn't particularly tough. He placed 5th. Ed Ruth was in that bracket, 3-time national champion, a few other tough guys, but he didn't really beat any of them. He did lose to some of them. So I'd say he's probably like a middle of the road All-American, which is great. It's a great accomplishment. But he wasn't anything special in college, if that makes sense. And then he didn't really continue his amateur career afterward, whereas Usman actually didn't start wrestling until high school, which is insane. That's a King Mo story as well. Like really late start. I don't know what his athletic background was before that, but obviously he played some sort of sport. And then he had a very good high school career, but it wasn't in a great state. I think he was in Texas, which is not really known for wrestling. He went to William Penn, which is a Division III school in Iowa. He wasn't that good there, but then he was a national qualifier, so he transferred to Nebraska Kearney, which is a Division II power program, and that's a really big program. And then by his junior year, he was a national finalist, and then his senior year, he was national champion at 174. Colby Covington also wrestled at 174, and then after that, he kept training at a local club, nothing big time, and he bumped up to 84 kilograms, which is like 185 pounds. So that tells you something right there. And he was pretty competitive. He went on a run for the 2012 cycle. He tried to make the Olympic team. He did not make the Olympic team, but he did have a pretty noteworthy victory over Pat Downey, who was the world team rep last year. And the year that Usman beat him, Downey was actually the junior world silver medalist. So that's pretty striking. Junior worlds is like 18 to 21 about years old. So it's not like they're kids. So he was one of the best in the world, probably, but the U.S. was tough at that weight. Jake Herbert, who took silver at the Olympics that year, I think Usman lost like 5-1 to Jake Herbert. So he really improved at a crazy rate. So I would say by the end of each of their respective amateur careers, Usman was like way more credentialed, just given his freestyle run. And to answer your actual question, as far as Usman's style, yeah, he was a counter wrestler. He's mostly looking at singles. Because he did a lot more work in freestyle, you actually see some of that come through. but you don't see it as often because no one shoots on him, except RDA. So actually, you got to see when RDA shot on him once. He locked his hands through the leg, through the crotch, and he sapped the corner, and he kind of lifted him there. So that's something you could use for an exposure in freestyle. So he's got good counters there.
Crotch lift? Is this my chance to say like the one wrestling term I might know?
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you so much. I want a gold star.
Yeah, but that's my basic rundown of them as wrestlers.
All right. So off the bat, like coming into this as an MMA matchup, what carries over from that is likely to be it's sort of interesting actually. It gives us an interesting sort of an interesting paradigm where on the feet, as a striker rather, I would say that Colby Covington is I think he's significantly more comfortable off the back foot than Kamaru Usman. He's got better footwork, I think. He's a better kicker. He has a little more reliable range tools, although certainly what we've seen out of Kamaru Usman in his most recent matchups, like just as you said with his wrestling career, the sort of arc we might expect out of a supremely gifted athlete, he seems to be developing really nicely. But Covington, as a wrestler and as a striker, is just like all confidence. And I think he's been a much more natural striker from the very beginning. So on the feet, this is maybe a matchup where, like so many MMA fights are, as I've been banging on and on about these days, it's a fight where the guy who comes forward is better served to win. Usman probably needs to come forward more. But on the flip side, what you just said would suggest that Usman is far better suited to defend wrestling off the back foot. He's far better suited defensively as a wrestler, whereas Covington, just by nature of his style, you would expect to, and I don't know if he's more willing or if it's just bred into him at this point, but more likely to just be taken down in one clean movement.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think part of it too is that when Colby Covington's pressuring, he's almost always just walking straight forward and not really, taking smaller steps or measuring the pressure. It's really just a straightforward, constant movement. So, I mean, he wasn't really taken down reactively too much. When RDA took him down, it was, he had, broken from the clinch and reversed the position, then made space and struck and then shot in, just like Colby does, actually. But, when he's striking, he's really thinking about striking. When he's wrestling, he's thinking about wrestling. He can go in between them, but he's not doing them as, like, connected movements, if that makes sense. Whereas Usman, I think he's always kind of in the headspace where he can be, preparing for what the wrestling's going to be. I think he thinks about what he does a lot more often, whereas Colby has these habits. It's just like, it's organic, you might say. Yeah,
sometimes to his detriment. Usman is definitely more of a thinker. Yeah, what I saw, so here's an interesting wrinkle. We both came into this having just researched both of these guys' fights with Rafael dos Anjos. We were both, this just shows how lazy, like, fight analysts are. Like, I don't know how to compare them. Well, they both fought one guy in common, so let's look at those fights. Yeah, what comes through in that one, looking at Usman striking, Usman, again, I still don't believe he's as comfortable. He's just not as much of a point and doer as Colby Covington. But whether or not he's thinking more of his wrestling, he's, I think, better served to transition between the two because of the way he has been building his striking. We saw him not only more successfully pinning Dos Anjos against the fence in the clinch, but also with his striking. Maintaining a proper distance, not falling in with his head. There were a lot of moments in that fight where Dos Anjos was trying to either measure or snap Usman's head back, just find a little moment to get his feet moving and get off the fence. And Usman looked remarkably comfortable and confident in his sense of distance, just allowing Dos Anjos' jabs to sort of skip past his face, knowing that he wasn't in range and didn't have to worry. I actually found myself really impressed with how well he kept himself over his feet, even if when he started throwing his strikes, they still looked to me a lot more mechanical than Colby's tend to.
Yeah, I mean, he's super patient. That was my main thing that I got from it. I don't know, there was something about the way that Colby goes about things that's kind of frantic. I don't think he lacks confidence, but I think it's just janky is the word I might say. The whole process is kind of janky, whereas Usman, I think, he has that thing where he can actually stand in front of you in the cage, and he's not super worried about what's coming back at him because he's got his jab and it's very long. And I mean, Colby jabs too, but Colby's jabs are something for him to shoot under, whereas Usman actually jabs to jab.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know. I'm willing to go out on that limb and say that Usman looks more self-contained and confident. That there is, with a lot of brawlers and swarmers, the more crazily aggressive kind of pressure fighters like Colby Covington, I think there's often a bit of insecurity being covered up there by the pace. I don't know if Colby Covington's style of trash talk should be any kind of indication, but I don't know the man is quite as confident as he would like to appear all the time. So I don't know how much that plays into the fight. Clearly he's found a style that works for him. Do you see this being a matchup where we will get to see a disappointingly small amount of wrestling exchanges? Do you think this will be? Do you think the wrestling games of these two fighters are going to be pivotal in this fight?
So my main read at first was that Colby Covington fights the same fight every time. So why wouldn't he try to barrel forward and shoot on Usman? And I still think that.
Well, he did. He didn't really against Maya.
That's true.
The one exception is, like everyone else, he just was terrified at the prospect of taking Maya to the ground. Maybe looking at Ben Askren, that really is a good idea. But yeah, typically you point him forward, he goes and does the same thing. I would agree.
But most of the time, that's what he's up to. And I feel like most people's read on the fight is probably similar to what his camp and his coaches are thinking, whereas they really want to try to enforce their pace. Because that's his main weapon is his pace. So even though it's not something that's been demonstrated as a weakness for Usman, I think the best way for him to actually, try to tire him out is to wrestle and wrestle on his terms, which would mean pressuring. So I had that in my back pocket to start with, just because that's like the rules of engagement. So I figured it doesn't really matter what Usman's game plan is, because Colby's going to try to shoot on him. He's going to try to clinch with him, and then they'll just be in his world then. But now that I'm watching again, watching the RDA fight from Usman, he actually has the much better game that's suited to, shooting in open space, actually like entering on shots, not trying to get to the cage first. So if someone wants to wrestle, I think Usman actually has a better shot of starting that off, just because he doesn't need to clear that entire distance of the cage to enter those situations. Because Covington hasn't really proven to be a good open space wrestler against anyone who's good at wrestling. I mean, even Lawler, he had a hard time in space, and Lawler's like a husk at this point. So it's interesting there. So I think they'll definitely wrestle, and I think once they are wrestling, it's going to go Usman's way pretty quickly.
The other thing I drew from the RDA fight, from Usman's fight with RDA, is that, I may still think that if put on the back foot, he would be in more trouble than Colby Covington. He was not easy to put on the back foot, and almost impossible to keep there. Much more so than Colby in his fight with RDA. And I think that that confidence really seems to come through, that he's just willing against someone who, by all rights should be a way better striker to stand his ground, to return fire. I think the fact that he does have a serviceable jab in his arsenal has something to do with that. But yeah, he was not at all easy to back off. So it just stands to reason to me that, like, if Covington can be expected to come forward relentlessly, even if no one's back nears the fence in the first engagement of each round, they're probably going to tie up pretty soon.
So let's say, hypothetically, Usman actually is the one that gets the pressure going and gets Covington to the cage. That's great. That's amazing for him. Even if Covington does get his game going and gets Usman to the cage, I don't think that's good for him, because he has this thing where the Lawler fight is probably the best he ever looked, breaking from the clinch to strike and to shoot and back to the clinch and so on, doing that whole chain. But once he's in the clinch, it's not really a good stable sticking position for him. That's the main lesson of the RDA fight. That's why I watched that fight in the first place, is because I felt the clinch would be very important for this matchup, seeing it's Usman's biggest strength. So I wanted to see, Covington against a good clincher. And he had a really hard time. So his main thing is, getting the underhook on the side he likes to shoot on, because he'll come off the leg up into the underhook. and he leans really heavily into that side.
I noticed that as well. He's not getting head position. He's really like dragging, just leaning hard into his opponent, and the man was ripe for elbows and knees to the face.
Yeah, so he keeps his hips back, which leaves his body wide open, and his other hand isn't really committed to any one thing, so he's trying to do this hand fight with the other hand, and RDA was basically framing on his head when he was leaning there and just giving him fits with the knees to the body. And he didn't like it at all. He kept breaking from the position because he didn't feel like hand fighting with RDA anymore, which is a terrible sign when you're going to fight someone who is going to give you fits in that domain. So that was bad. And then something else I saw, which was all I was looking for in that fight, was does RDA turn him around when they're on the cage, and how does he do it? And is that something Usman can do? And yeah, definitely. So basically, as soon as Covington tried to throw anything with that free hand, that gave the opening for an underhook on that side. So he has the whizzer on the shooting side. And Usman has shown whizzers before. He did it against RDA when RDA had him against the cage for a bit. So he'll definitely be there with that because that's the natural response to an underhook. So whizzer on one side. If he can get the underhook on the other side, he can lock his hands behind the back there. And because Covington keeps his hips so far back, he's really not in a stable position to be moving laterally. He's only good for linear pressure. So it was really easy for RDA to turn him around once he got there. And I mean, of course, Usman's going to be able to get a body lock over-under on Colby Covington, especially when he's serving up the over. I mean, it's not going to be hard to get one underhook. So that's really concerning. So I think even if Covington does get to the position he wants, it's going to turn into Usman's fight pretty quickly. And I just don't see him having a good time in the clinch with Usman. And I think they'll get there. Just the nature of the striking matchup leads me to believe that. What was that?
It just seems natural, right? It's just the nature of the matchup. Like I said before, they're going to run into each other unless one of them is uncharacteristically willing to back off.
Yeah, that's the thing. If Covington suddenly realizes that he can have a different game plan, I mean, he did it a little bit versus Damian Maia, and he did it a little bit actually versus Robbie Lawler. I think he gets tired. He's not tireless. He definitely wears down. So he does take those breaks because it's a little easier for him to be pumping out that volume striking than to be wrestling all the time. So he will outfight a little bit, but I don't think Usman's stationary and harmless enough for him to just stay on that without having to save himself a little bit by wrestling. Yeah. And I don't know. I don't think it's a good matchup for him at all.
Yeah, and all those specific wrestling things, this is my comparatively very amateurish read, but all of the specific clinch wrestling positions, it seems that Usman compares pretty favorably to Covington. When he gets into control positions, he does tend to, as a rule, keep his feet and hips a lot closer to his opponent, better posture.
Definitely.
Even when he's in on a shot, he tends to have much better, stronger posture and head position than Covington. He did not back down at all from the hand fights with RDA in the clinches. There were several moments where he was working on a single and RDA would go for that wrist control, and Usman used that really reliably to land some hellacious elbows. And I think, you bring up Covington's tendency to slow down. Maybe not the greatest sign for a pace fighter. Usually it's not a problem because the other guy is more tired than he is.
Definitely.
We mentioned before we began this segment, we were talking about the fact that Usman, despite being like one of the biggest guys in the welterweight division, someone who I don't think would look out of place at 185, a big muscular fighter, we have not seen him slow down or show signs of fatigue the way that we have seen from Colby in his first few 5-round efforts. Now you mentioned that the reason for that is largely that we haven't really seen anyone push Usman the way that Colby always pushes himself. And so that could be interesting. We can expect Colby to go in there and try to push a pace on Kamaru Usman. But I think another factor there, and I didn't want to mention this at the top because I think a lot of these other things tie into this and it would seem very reductive. A big factor for why we don't see Usman pushed and don't see Usman slow down is that he's freakishly strong. This would not be the first matchup, the first fight where who comes out more shattered from the grappling engagements is determined by just who's more freakishly powerful. So if Covington is more liable to burn himself out, just pouring effort into a stalemate, does it sound about right to you that also favors Usman? That like even if the clinch exchanges are going Covington's way, he's going to have to be tying up with someone that, at least in an eyeball test, is significantly stronger than him.
Yeah, and it's not like he actually gets a lot done when he's in the clinch, so even if he's in the better positions, I don't think he's really going to be doing much to wear Usman down, and if he is shooting on him, he's just opening himself up to, being countered and, being in worse situations. Also, based on in regards to Usman being strong, Coach Mike said something about, I'm trying to remember the exact quote, I think he said freaky Martian android strength.
Yes,
what Usman has.
I remember that quote well.
I love that. That's very accurate. So you watch him fight, and it does seem a little bit superhuman.
Yeah. Very, very powerful individual, Kamaru Usman. Can I tell you how fucking relieved I am, Ed? I was so scared before I called you that you were going to find some way to convince me to pick Colby Covington. I was so scared. And I feel such a great relief, which only tells me in my heart that, Colby Covington is going to find a way to win, and I'll be more crushed than I would have been otherwise. But it sounds like you're probably favoring Kamaru Usman. I definitely am. Are you favoring him as well?
Yeah. So basically, the round table that we did for the fight site, everyone pretty much had the same read on the actual dynamics of the matchup. Where people disagreed was whether or not Colby Covington was going to wrestle at all. So, in your head, if you're trying to craft a game plan for Colby Covington, you would tell him, stick on the outside and try to make Usman pressure you if he wants to wrestle. But I don't trust him at all. He doesn't seem like that kind of guy.
Usman is, as we've said, fearless, powerful, trusts in his power, has a reach advantage, has looked very durable, arguably more so than Colby Covington to this point in his career. I think if Colby does go on a back foot striking game plan, then to me that just kind of, I said his back footwork is better and more comfortable than Usman's, but Usman's pressuring footwork is not bad.
Right.
So that just sort of tells me that he's going to end up wrestling with his back to the fence instead of the other way around.
It's a rough matchup for him. There's not too many ways that he can avoid going into Usman's area of strength, and I think once he's there, he's just going to lose rounds. I don't see a finish or anything like that, although having watched those fights, neither Covington or Usman are very good in the pocket. They're both pretty uncomfortable and wild there. They fall apart a little bit in that space. Falling apart more for Covington, just being a little sloppy for Usman.
Yeah.
Covington's feet will straight up come together and not be in a stance anymore sometimes.
The technique falls apart more and more with each successive
it's concerning.
punch. Usman is just more, he just reads as stiff to me. Everything's just kind of mechanical. Reactions might come a half second too late. But I think he does a good job pretty good job across the board of keeping his stance, keeping his posture, keeping his eyes on his opponent, staying in position where, Covington doesn't. So, all right. Thank God we're both picking Kamaru Usman. Ed, thank you so much for coming on the show again to break down this fight with me. I leaned heavily on your expertise, and I think that the listeners will appreciate that. Anything to plug before I let you go?
Yeah, for sure. I have a few things. So I actually just made a video, my first actual long video.
Nice.
It's not an analysis. It's a highlight of the Alans. It was a tournament in Russia that took place over the weekend. It's all Russians. And so it's probably the last time for a while you're going to see that many Russians competing at once, just because of the recent scandal. So check that out. That's on the fight site. And then, tomorrow, which will be yesterday, I assume when this comes out, I have my Usman Covington piece coming out. I should have something on Aldo's takedown defense later this week. Something short, nothing crazy. And just overall on the fight site, we have all these UFC 245 articles. Tom Elliott wrote 5 bantamweight pieces. Danny Martin did a Max Holloway, Alexander Volkanovski breakdown, which is excellent. So definitely check that out. And mostly everything can be found on the fight site. So I just recommend staying plugged in for the fight week.
Seconded. Check Ed Gallo's stuff out on the Fight site and his pieces on bloodyelbow.com as well. And we'll be right back after this.
Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. You can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show.
Okay. Welcome back to Heavy Hands. I am joined once again by Phil McKenzie, who, by choice, chose not to break down that last fight with Ed Gallo. He said to me, I don't want to talk with my replacement. I don't want to break down fights with the guy who's moving into my fucking spot. And I understood. I get it. So, Phil, welcome back.
Also, it's going to be full of boring wrestlers.
Yeah, it was.
I'm going to cherry pick cool fights from now on.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have said this. I wouldn't have said this to Ed, but it was a really boring segment. Like, it sucked.
No doubt.
All right. Well,
so what guys? But you guys both picked Usman, correct?
Oh yeah, that's right. I want to give. So Ed and I both ended up picking Usman. I want to give Phil a chance to at least share some brief thoughts on that fight that he didn't get to discuss with us. So Phil, your rundown of the main event.
Yeah. So I was just going to say. Yeah, I think that there still is a concerning factor for me in that I'm not sure whether Usman is a tremendous open space striker. Like, he's so built towards forcing people to the fence that I think we can occasionally forget that he's looked a bit awkward in open space. Mm-hmm. He's gotten much better at forcing people into where he's really comfortable, but he's traditionally been able to do that most of the time. And I think Covington has become a pretty decent open stance striker. And but beyond that, like, I think it's mostly just things that you guys have probably hit on, is that Usman is both larger and appears to be a better technical wrestler, as well as being physically more powerful. Which means that I think the thing that Covington needs to save himself is just pure bloody insanity. If he can literally refuse to get pushed back at any point by Usman and just force him into a kickboxing fight the whole time, he might be able to just drain Usman in a kickboxing match, because I'm not sure that Usman particularly wants that kind of fight. But then again, neither of these guys have shown any capability or propensity to turn their A game off.
Right.
They both come forward pressure wrestlers, and I don't think Covington is mentally capable of not shooting for takedowns. He is convinced that he is the greatest wrestler in MMA to ever live, and he's going to go into tie-ups, and he's going to lose them.
I will point out again, as I pointed out to Ed, that Covington did avoid shooting takedowns against Damian Maia. So, like,
good point.
There is some ability within him, but I can't imagine him going in there against another wrestler and being like, no, I shouldn't wrestle with this guy. I don't know. I think he's far too insecure to accept that gambit.
A wrestler, not only that, from a rival Florida gym.
Right. Yeah, I don't see it happening. And I think the other thing is that, like, what we saw from Usman in the Woodley and RDA fights is that he's gotten a lot more confident in just standing his ground. I just don't know if, it might be interesting if Colby went out there and stood toe to toe and just tried to brawl him, on the feet. But at a certain point, like, I just think they're going to crash into each other and have to wrestle. So, like, and we all three of us, it appears, tend to agree that the more wrestling, the better for Kamaru Usman.
I will say, there was one analog of, Covington, who Usman has fought with, who was Michael Graves, his teammate from Team Evil back in the day. Mm-hmm. Also, just like a completely relentless wrestler. And again, like Usman won that fairly comfortably. It was notable. He did struggle a bit with some of the kicks of Graves. I don't know if he necessarily saw them coming that well. So just one of those like minor tactical things to look out for. Usman is quite an upright fighter.
Covington's not a bad
Covington
kicker.
is a very, very, very Covington is a very willing kicker.
Mm-hmm. But also, Usman loves to take people down off of kicks. So it's going to be good. These are all interesting fights, as we said. Thanks, Phil. I just wanted to, I'm glad you got a chance to put in your 2 cents. But let's move on now to the women's bantamweight title fight. Also fascinating. Amanda Nunes versus Germaine de Randamie. And I do want to emphasize that this is an interesting matchup. I think that, like, to me, there's a strong contrast here between, like, how these women have treated the concept of their legacies. Like, you can't accuse Amanda Nunes of running from an opponent or of ducking a fight without her going out there and knocking that person out in 30 seconds to prove you wrong. And so, like, I think people will look at this and say Amanda Nunes has proven her greatness. She absolutely has, by the way. I'm not arguing against that. And Germaine de Randamie, like, she's a nobody in comparison. I just want to point out that when everyone was upset at Germaine de Randamie for quote unquote ducking Cyborg, and you could even say that without the quotes, like whatever, call it whatever you want. She avoided a fight with Cyborg for whatever reason. Everyone's point about that was, oh, she's scared, she's going to lose, whatever. My thought quietly off to the side was, I think that's a winnable matchup. I'm not sure why she wouldn't take it, because I think she can win that fight. And I say that just to emphasize that I think Germaine de Randamie is much better than her resume would suggest. I think she has improved in the last few years. And I think she may be uniquely difficult for Amanda Nunes.
And specifically in the ways that Amanda Nunes has improved.
Right, yeah. So why don't you tell me more about that, please?
Well, so one of the interesting things is that I remember Stephen Wright actually said that, who had been working with Germaine de Randamie, that they had been like considering campaigning for the title for the fight against Cyborg if she ever came to the UFC. They were like, yeah, we'll do that before the whole debacle with the first featherweight title being between de Randamie and Holm, which was clearly, obviously an attempt to set Holm up as with the belt again. But yeah, so they'd been apparently talking about that. They really thought that was a winnable fight. So yeah. And that was when they had no reason to say that they wanted to fight her. But yeah, I think de Randamie was trying to probably campaign for some softer matchups before she got Cyborg, but it is what it is.
And if she was, like worried perhaps, like I think as a striker, she could pose a lot of problems for Cyborg, to be honest. Maybe she was worried about Cyborg turning to her wrestling and wanted a little more time to work up to it. That would make sense because her wrestling has notably improved in like her last 3 fights.
Yeah. So, I mean, what we've seen from de Randamie has been, the development of a much more kind of focused, patient, outside striking game. One of the ones that is like very well made for MMA. She is just hard to get a shot on. Whether that's, you've mentioned many times about how boxing and wrestling footwork are basically the same thing. She's a primary example of someone who has been good at this. Not only has she done that, but she's been good at disengaging from the clinch, stiff-arming and pushing away. And
like Joanna Jędrzejczyk, she is also a brutal person to clinch fight with. So when you do miss a takedown and end up against the fence, you are going to get fucked up.
And most of the developments we've seen from Nunes have been in terms of her. Most of the developments we've seen from Nunes have been in terms of her kickboxing. And so these two fought before, and obviously it was a fight between two of them that were both fairly raw in their own ways. In that Amanda was just a unstructured violence burst machine, and de Randamie had her wrestling was not there yet at all. But in the time since, Amanda Nunes has become a much more focused range kickboxer, but has not gone to the wrestling and the ground and pound nearly as much. So the question becomes, if Amanda Nunes tries to go for the same approach that she went for against, say, Valentina Shevchenko, does that work? Because she seems, as she's moved into becoming a champion, that unless she's on the feet, she does seem to want to conserve her energy by not shooting takedowns.
Yeah, I don't know. It's always difficult to guess how she'll approach it. I mean, just to lay it out a little more clearly, like in the first fight between Nunes and de Randamie, she just quickly got de Randamie down and went insane, finishing her with strikes on the floor. So I don't know. It's difficult to say if she'll try that. I kind of suspect she won't. I don't know. We have seen this out of a few other ATT fighters, I think, a tendency towards just like broader stylistic development and not like fight by fight game planning. We've not seen a lot of ATT fighters like seriously change up their approach specifically for an opponent, right? So I think I tend to believe that this is kind of championship Nunes, a much more patient, long range, sort of counter and kick oriented kickboxer. And I think, that makes sense to me, because even if she were to come in here looking for takedowns, Amanda Nunes is not like the greatest shot wrestler in the world by a long shot. She's physical and she's strong. Not only is de Randamie maybe a slightly worse athlete, but also pretty big and powerful. But as you said, her positioning and her awareness of wrestling threats has gotten much, much better. So, like, you would have to actually hit a really nice shot. Like, let me just put it this way. Is Amanda Nunes a better wrestler than Holly Holm? To me, they're probably on a par with each other.
Yeah, she's definitely a far more dangerous top position threat should
absolutely.
She get a takedown, but she's not a much better wrestler now.
Yeah, absolutely. More violent in any other position that comes before or after the takedown. But when it comes to threatening a takedown, she's not. She may even be a slightly less sophisticated offensive wrestler than Holly Holm. So, and Germaine de Randamie, that was now 2 or 3 fights ago for her. She very easily stopped Holm from actually managing to take her down at any point. So, I'm expecting a kickboxing match. Do you agree?
Mm-hmm.
And if we get one, then the really interesting thing here is that de Randamie is, I don't know if she's as quick as Nunes. Again, I don't think she's the athlete that Nunes is. Perhaps in part just because I think she's a few years older. But she does have reach. Let's see. Amanda Nunes has a 69-inch reach. Germaine de Randamie, wingspan of 71 inches. When is the last time Amanda Nunes was at a reach disadvantage to an opponent?
I don't know if ever. Cyborg, I think, was close.
Yeah. Well, Holly Holm did have a 50-inch or a 1-inch reach advantage. Though Holm, I don't think, is particularly great at using her reach. That tends to be the problem when you lean really, really heavily over your front leg and commit your whole upper body. Like a reach is really useful when you don't want your face to be a target the moment you try to engage, and Holly Holm has always had that problem. I guess Cyborg, but Cyborg certainly didn't play the right approach. No, Cyborg didn't have a reach advantage either. So that to me is interesting. Germaine de Randamie has a more patient, long-range style of fighting. This may be the first, like she could run into the problem that Valentina Shevchenko did, of course, if she really tries to play a counter-punching game. Like, I think there's actually a strong possibility we could get a really slow fight here. But I think she's also a lot more willing to just like dive bomb in on a big right hand counter or throw a hard combination than Valentina Shevchenko. And if we do get tie-ups, again, I think she's, Shevchenko is not a bad clinch fighter, but de Randamie has height and she's an incredibly violent clinch fighter. So there are just these, a matchup that was not easily winnable for Nunes before against a comparably athletic counterpuncher in Shevchenko, plus reach, plus a strong, equally strong, if not stronger, clinch game. I don't know. I that doesn't feel like an unwinnable fight for Germaine de Randamie.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things to hold on to is the old adage of you can never beat the people you lost to.
Well, of course.
So, yeah. So, I mean, the problem is that de Randamie has... I mean, she had... I don't remember Holm shooting many takedowns on her is the thing. I mean, and neither did Nunes, really. Nunes just kind of got her in the clinch and then... got de Randamie in the clinch and then forced her up against the cage. And then, because de Randamie has been able, I don't know how much she's been insulated by her athleticism, by her size and
certainly
strength,
some, yeah.
Against people because some of the people that she's fought have been, and this is one of the problems with bantamweight being an immensely unequal division, is that they've either been strong but notably not quick, like Raquel Pennington, or they've just been, athletically non-existent, like Anna Elmos or Larissa Pacheco. Holm is really the only. Holm is really the and I guess Aspen Ladd are the only athletically threatening opponents that she's had. So I wouldn't be surprised if Nunes could just push her up against the cage and get her down again. I mean, Nunes did also take Holm down very briefly when she fought her.
That's true.
And I guess that's the thing about Nunes is that I mentioned that she conserves her energy more now, but I think just as her confidence has grown, it has made her cardio much, much better. She has generally had so much less problems in these fights because she's been controlling them, that she's actually just been able to keep a reasonably high pace.
As with a lot of ferociously violent fighters, it sort of suggests that there was a lot of insecurity fueling that, right? She was anxiously just trying to kill people before they could kill her. And now that I agree. Now that she's become more confident, she's more comfortable, so she doesn't feel like she's less of sort of just like an input-output, receive stimulus, respond. She's more thoughtful. She's freer to actually make decisions in her fights now. And I agree. I think that has a lot to do with her improved stamina. I just watched. Please.
And as you alluded to, de Randamie doesn't keep a high pace herself.
Right.
She's not going to be forcing a high pace out of Nunes, and that's sort of been one of the stories of everyone who's fought Nunes, with the exception of Cyborg, who went completely nuts.
There's got to be a middle ground.
The thing is with Nunes is that she just has too much offense everywhere. If she doesn't necessarily have to, consistently work a wrestling game, if she gets top position and then can immediately either threaten to win the fight or just do horrific amounts of damage from there. She has so many. She can, as she showed, she can win fights with kicks the last time out. She can win fights with her hands. She can she's a pretty good submission threat. And in this kind of fight, just the ability to win either the entire fight or rounds with bursts of explosive offense from multiple positions means that I've just kind of always got to favor her.
Yeah, I tend to agree. Mostly it's the fact that she's a lot more willing to sort of fill space with less meaningful volume. That's not something that de Randamie ever does. Germaine de Randamie, I think, would be a vastly better fighter than she is now, and she's already a lot better than I think most people give her credit for. If she would just throw more throwaway jabs,
Yeah, that's the other thing. She's not much of and I think that comes back to your Shevchenko comparison.
Yeah,
de Randamie does not initiate very much.
Right.
A lot of that home fight was her just intercepting Holmes' blitzes.
And just like when Holm fought Shevchenko, like, Holm can't help it. Like, she's going to initiate and run into that shit the same way over and over. So that was, I think, a very good, favorable matchup for Germaine de Randamie. This one, not quite so much. Yeah, she's got these like physical parodies with Nunes that most of Nunes' opponents don't. I do want to say, having just watched it, the Nunes caught a kick in her first fight with de Randamie, then drove her to the fence, and then dropped for a single and tripped her off balance. So yeah, she's still not a better shot wrestler than Holly Holm. That's how she got her down, but Holm didn't really shoot either. You may have said that before. She went into the clinch and pushed her against the fence. She did try to drop for single. She did try to trip and lift de Randamie off her feet. I do think there's strong evidence that de Randamie is a lot more comfortable defending those things and maintaining her balance than she used to be. So I still wouldn't. I would still be, I think, a little surprised if Nunes came in here and just did exactly the same shit she did in their first fight. But the output is big. The flexibility of her game is big, like the sort of diversity of her striking. I just don't think that typically de Randamie is like assertive enough to force her fight, whatever that is, on Nunes. I do still think, though, that there is a bigger chance than pretty much anyone else of de Randamie just sort of barely hanging in there, staying competitive, and catching Nunes with something really big. She is a quick, powerful counter puncher. And Nunes is not exactly a defensive maestro, especially not once she has actually committed to throwing her own shots. So, like, I don't think de Randamie is as picky as Valentina Shevchenko when it comes to choosing moments to trade with an aggressive opponent. So that still makes this matchup really interesting to me, but I tend to agree. I'm picking Nunes as well. And I think that does it for this week's episode of Heavy Hands. It's a long one, as they pretty much all are, but this one more deserving than most, I think. 3 fascinating matchups. UFC 245 is absolutely a card to look forward to. My thanks again to Ed Gallo for joining me for segment 2. My thanks to you as well, Phil, for joining me for segments 1 and 3. And hopefully, well, I don't know if I want to plug it. Hopefully we'll have some bonus content coming out to you this week. Don't rely on that, because we're not exactly sure what we're doing just yet. But we do have bonus content available. So go over and check out the Heavy Hands Patreon. It's just $3 a month to get all of our bonus episodes. And, yeah, Phil, anything coming out this week, pertinent to the big card?
I think we might be doing previews for all 3 of the title fights.
Hell
so
yeah.
Keep a lookout for that. I'm not sure yet, but I think that is the case. Other than that, I will say to obviously check out, Ed's excellent piece on the wrestling of Usman and Covington, which is required reading. Also, one of the other vaping scooter gang, the old man Danny Marty, has released a very good piece on Holloway versus Volkanovski, which is definitely worth reading.
Far too many. When is my show going to start getting plugs on the fight site? That's what I want to know. Where's the quid pro quo? Goddammit.
You've got to face your fears and get one of the bullies on the show first. Then that's how you get their respect.
I'll just bring Kyle back on. He's the bully I know. that feels like a pretty safe way to go about it. All right. So yeah, thanks again to Ed. Check out Phil's previews. There are a couple short videos for me coming out on the MMANation.com YouTube. I'm working on a breakdown, but you know my new rule. I'm not going to plug some shit until I've actually done it. So check out the videos on MMANation.com on YouTube. For now, that's all I've put out this week. And I'm very excited for next week's show, because we are going to get to talk about all of the stuff that happened at this guaranteed to be interesting card. So I hope you guys are looking forward to UFC 245 as much as we are. Thank you very much for listening. And if you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands. Isn't it a pleasure, Phil, to get to break down interesting fights?
It is.
It's great.
Also, do we want to maybe specify that, like, because also I met one of my friends I hadn't seen for a while, and he was like, "Are you leaving Heavy Hands?" And I was like, "No." It might be best to specify that, like, Ed is. I am not on the Ed thing, not because I am being phased out, but because it is a time zone thing. The conspiracy theories are not like.
I didn't even think of that. I'm just going to stick this in as the outro, you saying that, so that only the most dedicated listeners will be aware that you're still on the show.